Whereas God is construed as pure acts for Stein and Aquinas, creatures are ever in a state of what she calls becoming. Yet within this constant state of becoming, creatures become co-creators with God, in which the individual becomes, as it were, a victim of its vital task. Stein points to the self-emptying circle of life, wherein creatures give themselves over through their vital task to the point of abandonment. In such a manner, the being of the form is life, and life is the forming of matter. In such a scheme, life generates life by becoming a willful victim of itself. Life begets life, and to live is to evolve, to become. In recognizing the creaturely process of becoming, Stein extends the potency act hermeneutic to its full existential potential. This is not merely wishful thinking, but a radical acknowledgement of that clarion metaphysical reality that Aristotle recognized and poignantly articulated ages ago. It is clear that actuality is prior to potentiality. Stein puts it this way, quote, "Actual being emerges from a potential being and passes into a potential being, but all potentiality is phenomenally upheld by actuality, and it cannot uphold actuality," end quote. Logically, according to the analogia entis, or the analogy of being, in thinking God in terms of being, this assertion leads us to the threshold of eternity, a personal eternity that appears as necessarily anterior to finite, personal, self-reflexive, and co-creating creatures. The potency act, while it may seem old-fashioned to some, when construed according to a phenomenological tonality, offers compelling insight into the question of being and the personal creator-creature relationship. Yet Stein goes one step farther. She elucidates the phenomenon of human personal evolution in community life, a community based on a fundamental openness to the other and openness to grace. Stein reveals the phenomenal becoming of the self, face to face with other selves, in community. The communal phenomenon is a prerequisite for a progressive opening of one to another. Words to describe such an opening would be love and empathy. Love and empathy refer to human activities that transpire between others and have the net effect of building one another up. Authentic and healthy personal unfolding happens for oneself according to the measure of affirming responsiveness of others. If one experiences a lack of care and nurture, such a person's development would be arrested or even undergo a kind of personal degeneration. On a rudimentary level, it is safe to say that an infant would die if responsibility for her care is not assumed by another. What Stein means by a progressive opening to one another is essentially a series of decisions for vulnerability, a willingness to hazard oneself before the sway of another, inside the hope that this interaction will in the end be nurturing rather than destructive. The infant is exemplar in her radical vulnerability and dependence on others for her care. It can even be said that the very nature of the infant is to be in a state of constant openness to others. Likewise, Stein suggests that throughout a human being's lifespan, her unfolding and development are achieved to the degree of her openness. This decision to be open to others is free and voluntary, inasmuch as the affirmative response of care by another is free and voluntary. It is in light of the order of becoming that human vocation assumes a universal constellation, namely intersubjective communion. For Stein, intersubjective communion ultimately refers to the communion of saints which participates eternally in the innermost life of God. Undoubtedly, this language is theologically charged, but this reality can also be framed in terms of the potency act hermeneutic developed by Stein. If eternal actuality is disclosed in personal spiritual beings as eternal love, and the actuality of love is performed only in its consummated union of a plurality of persons in love, then the notion of communion of saints is the teleological consequence of eternal actuality as eternal love. You'll have to refer to the video to ruminate over that phrase. Moreover, Stein identifies God as the plenitude of love, who may have chosen to create for himself a special abode in each human soul, so that the plenitude of divine love might find in the manifold of differently constituted souls a wider range for its self-communication. Stein contends that God affirms himself in his being, who is from eternity and has never been placed in existence. His is not only a being conscious of itself, but a being approving itself in the highest form of approval, namely love. His being is blessed self-love. Eternal actuality, as eternal love, only makes sense in its Trinitarian configuration, which bespeaks a simultaneous oneness of substance and plurality of persons. While divine love, as eternal actuality, is constant in relation to its object, namely personal spiritual beings, it is to be recognized as such only by an active awakening on the part of its recipient. In other words, a human being, as a living admixture of potency and act, must awaken to eternal being in order to partake of its life, resulting in an elevation of spiritual being in the life of the human person. This awakening is the most fundamental act of freedom, though executed in an intersubjective context, of which a human person is capable and is characteristic of life in the spirit. Stein describes the life of grace, in which the innermost being of the soul is like a vessel into which flows the Spirit of God. That is the life of grace, if the soul, by virtue of its freedom, opens itself to this vital influx. It is important to observe that this is not a Pelagian understanding, as if human persons achieved a level of spiritual perfection on their own initiative. Rather, Stein insists that human beings are not capable of this self-surrender to divine love by themselves. It is precisely eternal actuality and love which accomplishes the personal openness of being in each and every personal spiritual being, since it is ultimately a matter of divine freedom. Yet human cooperation is necessary for divine life to enter into the human soul and remain within. The cooperation necessary can be described by the Latin word fiat, that is, let it be done, so be it, amen. Fiat is precisely the openness of freedom that elevates one to the divine life of love and self-surrender to the point of abandonment. Mary of Nazareth is the paradigmatic figure of this docility and obedience, which listens for the word from the other and responds with the life-giving fiat of faith. Just as a plant's shoot strives upwards to the light, grace is essentially the justifying negation of the negation and freely turning toward God, demanding a personal receptive response and resulting in the heightening of being. The negation of the negation refers to the willful resistance to annihilation, the resolute no to the degenerative process of unbecoming and the threat of non-being. The heightening of being is none other than a lifting of the human soul to the heights of actualized being through the process of becoming, a stretching of creaturely being into the transcendent realm, an elevation wrought by the love that knows no fear. Rolling. In sum, authentic human personhood is realized in and through the opening to another, a letting of another's being come over oneself. Is this way of life not precisely the way of the cross? In her book that reflects upon the life and work of St. John of the Cross, The Science of the Cross, Stein writes, quote, "For Christ accomplished his greatest work, the reconciliation and union of humankind with God, in the utmost humiliation and annihilation on the cross. When the soul realizes this, it will begin to understand that it too must be led to union with God through annihilation, a living crucifixion in the sensual as well as in the spiritual part. As in the desolation of his death, Jesus surrendered himself into the hands of the invisible and incomprehensible God, so the soul must enter the midnight darkness of faith, which is the only way to this God." End quote. Insofar as one surrenders oneself to the dark night of the paradoxical phenomenon of the cross, one opens to the unfolding movement of God's grace through a responsive fiat that simply lets it happen.